Black Lives Matter. I have seen polarizing political issues taking the spotlight in my lifetime, dating all the way back to the Clinton administration. There will always be movements that divide large swaths of the populace among political lines, be it the use of torture, Islamophobia, transphobia, immigration policy, or Gamergate. I just never expected that such an obvious talking point, like the one I stated above, would become so contentious, so divisive. I didn't think it would be something that anyone could even argue against. I'll say it again. Black Lives Matter. Reactions to that phrase and its associated movement can be boiled down to one of two responses in the mind of the listener. Either they empathize and aren't being willfully ignorant to a very real and present systemic problem, or they don't particularly care for black people. I'm not going to waste time attempting to explain why Black Lives Matter, because this late in the game, either you get it or you don't. Instead, I want to take some time to give a little bit further depth and nuance to the phrase. I want to show how the majority of black people in America are forced to navigate the difficulties of surviving neoliberal capitalism while also being hindered by the mechanisms of systemic racism. White supremacy is present in the very founding documents of this nation and has shaped policy and societal changes ever since. Whenever you see a black protest in the streets, in the media, on the web, understand that in their mind, this goes even further than just police brutality. It is about all aspects of our survival in this society. The conversation definitely needs to go further. So let's begin. If you look at a visual representation of Maslow's hierarchy of need, shelter is right there, present in the very foundation of the pyramid. Without reliable, affordable shelter, the effectiveness of outreach and community engagement will be severely reduced. We cannot, as a society, meaningfully address issues such as addiction, mental health, or abuse unless the victim has consistent and safe housing. And honestly, this isn't even a particularly hot take. More than one country has shown the benefits of providing condition-free housing to those experiencing homelessness pay dividends. Instead, I want to explore the history of housing oppression that black people in America have faced since the country's founding. So, we'll go back briefly to the start of the transatlantic slave trade. A particularly unpleasant and smelly variety of rodent might suggest that black people had an adequate housing arrangement while they were being kept in bondage. And I really can't believe that I even have to say this, but I will point out why this is wrong for at least two reasons. First and foremost, a prison isn't a home. Being kept somewhere against your will under fear of being tracked down and tortured is not the same as having shelter. The other main thing to remember is that a black man, woman, or child in America during the days of chattel slavery did not have housing security. It is an established fact that they were often traded between owners, babies were ripped from their mother's arms, and families were split apart to maximize profits at the expense of human suffering. Fast forward to after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. One would think that black people could then seek out and acquire land and housing on their own. Well, this wasn't the case. Kind of hard to do when you still weren't legally allowed to purchase or stake claim to land. You couldn't start any kind of viable business and had almost non-existent local support structures outside of other former slaves. So most former slaves and their offspring were basically forced into serf-like farming contracts with white landowners. They would till the soil, harvest the fat of the land, in exchange for a share of the crops. This was known as sharecropping. Local merchants would provide food and supplies on credit. The landowner would provide housing, seeds, and tools, and any necessary livestock, and they would take the majority of the crop and sell it for their own profit. The landowners exercised full control over the means of production and dictated what crops were grown, and oftentimes required the sharecroppers to sell back an additional percentage of the crop directly to them. So they also had the ability to control the profits and use this to exploit the sharecroppers with well below market rates. Whatever the sharecropper could keep and sell on their own usually went to pay for their food and supplies. This was oftentimes a debt that they owed to the merchants who provided these supplies. This rent-seeking behavior meant that the majority of black people in the southern states did the majority of the work and received little of the profits, nor had any opportunity to save up and buy their way out of this exploitative arrangement. Good thing that doesn't happen anymore, and this is all ancient history, right? Oh, and someone may throw out the argument that poor white immigrants were also sharecroppers. To that I say yes, some white people were sharecroppers, but the landowners were all white. So, black people in the northern states after the Civil War didn't fare much better. There was a large influx of newly freed slaves into the northern states after the war, and they were met with a largely hostile white majority population. The majority of white residents in the northern and western cities demanded segregation, and most African Americans were forced to cluster in low-income neighborhoods, paid at lower rates than their white peers, and struggled to establish schools to educate generations new and old. In the late 1800s, many labor unions explicitly denied membership to black workers. As a result, many black laborers had no solidarity with said unions, but I'll talk more about that a little bit later. During this time, black people were at the mercy of absentee landlords and forced to reside in crumbling, dilapidated tenant housing, having no means to avoid being charged inflated rents. After the First World War, there was a push to correct the effects of the Great Depression. New Deal policies were being enacted and carried out all the way through until after the Second World War. White returning veterans had the means to utilize newly established federally backed home loans to move into new suburban communities. Black veterans returning home were greeted with restrictive covenants and redlining, basically policies that required developers to specifically refrain from investing in black neighborhoods and established areas where lenders could refuse to lend or sell to black home buyers. Follow that up with the interstate highways system, which tore through majority black neighborhoods to install convenient transportation for white suburban families. Many black homes were either taken via eminent domain or bought out from the black owners at well below market value to clear way for the freeways. Many legal and housing experts refused to assist black residents. As such, it was pretty much impossible for them to mount any form of legal defense to this invasion of their neighborhoods. In the early 90s, the process of gentrification that had been lurking just around the corner began in earnest. Black residents are overrepresented in poor inner-city neighborhoods that were often neglected by their city councils. So now that the city decides to build a sports stadium or build some pricey new apartments or condos, they can easily push into black neighborhoods and take up all of the dilapidated low-cost land. These new developments would bring more and more wealthy young white professionals into the city, attracted by the new construction and cheap land. This influx of wealthy residents didn't improve the material conditions of the black residents. It instead forced the local rents to spike in a frequency that they couldn't keep up with, and the black residents, with their dropping property values and already limited means, were unable to fight back against the corporate entities buying up the neighborhoods. Of course, in all of this, I haven't even mentioned the multiple times that black homes and businesses were literally razed to the ground by white supremacists. The move bombing in Philadelphia and the burning down of an affluent black neighborhood in Tulsa that led to the Tulsa race riots. Going forward, there need to be policies passed that facilitate permanent, unconditional dwellings for black residents, as well as force developers to adhere to a strict one-for-one policy of affordable housing when constructing new residential housing units. FHA loans need to be made available to black home buyers at the same approval rates and availability as they were during the boom years. This could be funded through a special appropriation or fund of some sort, or maybe reparations or something like that. I don't know. I feel like I watched a great YouTube video with terrible audio about that somewhere. Anyway, Search the news for any major city in the country, and you'll see stories of police being deployed to break up homeless encampments, offering no housing solutions for the now displaced residents. Gentrification is now more pervasive than ever, as black neighborhoods across the country are being gutted and revamped by corporate developers to make way for expensive condos, shops, and vanity projects of culinary colonizers. It's at the point in my city that whenever a new brewery pops up, I wonder how many hundreds of dollars the future rent went up for poor black residents. Black Americans have been historically denied the opportunity to own and occupy property in cities across the country. If Black lives matter, then black homes matter too. Now, let's talk about education. Specifically, I want to talk about how education for black students has been a struggle for equality spanning centuries, up to and including the present day. We cannot progress as a society unless we once and for all acknowledge the fact that black education matters. First, I want to briefly cover some history. To start at the beginning means that sadly, once again, we'll have to start back where black people were held in chattel slavery for multiple centuries in North America. The first Africans who were brought here had the majority of their cultural heritage destroyed by force. Speaking in their native language, worshiping their native gods, or even just using their birth names were all actions that resulted in brutal punishments. As more generations were born into bondage and the older generations died off, their ethnic roots were all but lost to the ages. They were taught to speak English and worship the Christian God. Yet despite this, they were often forced to remain illiterate. It's a time-honored tradition to enforce oppression against a marginalized demographic by forcing illiteracy on them. Black people were beaten and even killed for learning how to read, and some states even made it a crime to teach any slave how to read or write. Until the complete abolition of chattel slavery, schools for black students were virtually non-existent. It would be many more years after the passage of the 13th Amendment before the southern states had public schools for black students. The first historically black universities would be established. Many of them were state-funded institutions built specifically to teach black students during a time when all education institutions were still segregated. Some were even built by freed slaves. A problem arose in that black schools were almost all underfunded and poorly staffed. When the public school system was established across the United States, these newly funded districts used property taxes at the local level to fund the schools. This meant that the poor, financially struggling black communities were forced to scrape by while lacking the necessary financial resources to ensure a quality education. Their buildings were often run down, necessary maintenance wasn't performed, and they suffered from increased class sizes. Many of these issues stem from the fact that a lot of public schools in the inner city are still very much segregated. While no schools in the U.S. are de jure segregated or segregated by law, several are still de facto segregated or functionally segregated. Keep in mind also that in many states, New York being one prime example, segregation is still allowed if it is an unintended consequence. I've previously covered how there was a white flight to the suburbs during the boom years, and many black residents in the cities were stuck in low-income conditions in increasingly impoverished neighborhoods. The result is many instances of adjacent school districts with shocking gaps in performance and funding, and this separation often neatly falls among racial lines. Attempts to rectify this have often failed. It's gotten to the point that oftentimes the best sources of education in the inner city comes from private schools, which normally have to charge tuition to fund their classes and educator salaries. This has led to an even more sinister problem. Many states are now running voucher programs in an attempt to allow students the ability to attend better funded schools. It's a complex system that varies by state, but I'll use my own home state of Ohio's absolutely terrible system called Ed Choice as an example. So imagine that the assigned school where a public school student resides currently has a failing grade by the state's performance ranking system. That student is eligible to receive a cash subsidy towards attending another, better performing school in their area. This money is not paid to the student, but instead works as a sort of transfer of funding from the assigned public school district to whatever other school that student would attend. In the state of Ohio, one public school student is estimated to be worth $5,000 annually in taxpayer funding. So this $5,000 for that student is now transferred to that chosen school in the form of a voucher. On the surface, this doesn't sound too bad. Taxpayer funding is going towards educating a student, and they have a chance at a better education. But much like a bed of roses, there's a rotting, decaying, gruesome truth underneath. First of all, the ed choice system is a lottery. For reasons we'll get into, the state can't reposition every student in a failing public school. So much like the failures of capitalism, only a lucky few are able to escape the prison of poverty. Another downside to this is that for every student that receives an Ed Choice voucher to attend an out-of-district or private school instead of their assigned district, that is $5,000 less going towards funding an already underfunded failing district where many disadvantaged low-income students are forced to attend. This only serves to further compound the problem. Also, the last issue should be pretty obvious from 2 sentences ago to attentive listeners. Yes, I said out of district or private. This has created a system where students can go to a private school, one that normally charges tuition on a taxpayer subsidy. Let me make sure that I'm driving this point home. In my state, Ed Choice vouchers mean that taxpayer money meant for public schools are in fact funding private schools, many of which are operated by religious institutions. Hold on, I really hate to belabor the point, but heck, one last time. Untaxed religious institutions are also receiving taxpayer funding at the expense of underfunded public schools. I feel like the founding fathers had something to say about that, like an amendment or something. Anyway, for many of these private schools, it's not even a small contribution. There are a number of private schools in the state of Ohio that receive more in Ed Choice voucher subsidies than they gain from charging tuition. Man, I don't try to, court the militant atheist crowd, but everyone should be at least a little bit angry about that. But to bring this back to the topic at hand, I'll give you one guess as to the racial makeup of the majority of these criminally underfunded public schools who are being robbed of their funding. This system, it cannot be allowed to continue. No thought is being given to the failing schools that desperately need the funding to improve their performance. Any meaningful reform needs to involve a national standard on funding for public schools tailored at the state levels with the express and sole purpose of bringing education rates and performance of majority black inner city schools up to par with their private and white suburban counterparts. Also, while the conversation is currently focusing on police brutality, this would be a great time to remove armed police officers from schools. In the late 90s and early aughts, we saw a nationwide push for zero tolerance towards behavioral issues. This was often disproportionately weaponized against black students. In the wake of the Parkland school shooting, students who survived the attack rapidly became outspoken public figures in their advocacy for gun control. Most people are familiar with individuals like David Hogue. There was, however, a sizable contingent of black student demonstrators whose message was ignored in favor of the white students' discourse. The school resource officer, who gained national notoriety for his inaction during an active shooting where children died, has shown no such hesitation in the past when it comes to tackling black children. There needs to be a multi-pronged approach that covers all of the bases, including educational resources, teacher salaries, food and housing and transportation, childcare and healthcare. This is the essence of funding education, and this is what we need to show that if Black lives matter, then black education matters as well. So let's shift gears for a moment and talk about jobs. Right now, we live under neoliberal capitalism. This is an undeniable fact of life for anyone living in the United States. Unfortunately, capitalism is poorly suited to address the needs of the underprivileged and systemically oppressed. As a result, in a society that requires its residents to exchange their labor for currency, which will then be exchanged for shelter, clothing, and food, employment is all but a requirement. So in this part, I want to make sure that I explain why black jobs matter. Well-meaning liberals and centrists like to think of the job market as a fair and egalitarian environment. They'll defend a hierarchical system where the workforce is locked in a constant state of competition against each other just for the means to earn a comfortable living. I ascribe these views to liberals and centrists because I think many of them can still claim some level of ignorance. Liberals are pretty much synonymous with ignorance, honestly. But I don't include radical right, because they know darn well that the system is unfair and openly advocate for making it even less fair. Let's go to the beginning of the process. Getting the job. Even taking out the whole host of systemic issues that would work against a black candidate having a comparable resume, black candidates are often judged more harshly when being considered for a position with a company. In fact, a black candidate with no criminal record is less likely to be called back for a job than a white candidate with a criminal record and equal qualifications. Candidates with black names or ethnocentric names are less likely to be called back for the job than an equally qualified white candidate. Due to the issues stemming from systemic poverty, black candidates are more likely to have poor credit history. There are generally less banks with favorable lending conditions in black neighborhoods. This has left a void that would be filled by predatory payday lending and pawn establishments. Black candidates have faced negative scrutiny for years over wearing their own natural hairstyles in the workplace. My last job literally had a company policy prohibiting, and I quote, locks, cornrows, or other twisty styles. There was a point where labor unions refused to admit black members and in turn would vilify the black laborers who, unrepresented in the union, would rightfully continue working during declared strikes. They were barred entry from the unions and then painted as the enemy when they had to keep working because they had no support from the unions. On several occasions, Italian American, Irish Americans, and Jewish laborers all clashed with black workers, at times escalating to the point of riots in major American cities, all over not wanting black people to have access to the higher-paying blue-collar jobs that they felt black people didn't deserve. There are whole Wikipedia pages devoted to race riots that took place during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Heck, one of MLK's last speeches was at a labor rally. And even to this day, you can literally pick an industry at random and see a serious disparity in the amount of black workers in high-skilled or high-paying roles. Any effort to try and educate people on things like workplace bias or race theory is fought against by the establishment, tooth and nail. Now, everything I've just previously described are all hallmarks of white supremacy. It's right there in the very foundation of our country, and it's prevalent in all aspects of society. And this is what we are fighting against, nonstop, every single day. It is only by the tireless, unending efforts of pro-black activists that any progress has been made whatsoever. And what we have today is only the bare minimum that we were able to claw from the clutches of the establishment. Every public aspect of the life of a black individual is impacted, and capitalism is just a mechanism that allows the white supremacist establishment to carry out this continued oppression. But ending capitalism won't end the pervasive anti-black sentiment in this society. And in this battle, we are forced to take whatever victory we can. We kneel, we fight, we protest, we die. This matters. My life matters. Our lives matter. Our education, our homes, our health, and our jobs, they all matter. This is why Black Lives Matter. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment. Make sure to click subscribe. You can follow me on Twitch where I stream games and stuff. Follow me on Twitter. And if you're so inclined, feel free to check out my Patreon. Thanks again.